in the church, you never hope for a crisis, but sometimes crisis comes at you, whether that's a crisis with your leadership or a crisis like a natural disaster in your area, a financial crisis. There's all kinds of things that can happen in a church community. Are you ready, and what do you do as a church communicator in those moments? Hey, my name is Joanna LaFleur. Welcome to Word Made Digital Tutorials. In this tutorial, we are interviewing an expert on church communications in crisis. His name is Justin Dean. He's an entrepreneur, he's an author, he runs a large church conference himself, but he comes from a significant background in dealing with church communications in crisis. From 2011 to 2015, Justin was the communications director at Mars Hill Church in Seattle, where Mark Driscoll was. Do you remember that whole story? Well, Justin was the lead, the face, the voice, the words that were responding to a total crisis in that church that, as he's going to say, in some ways couldn't have been anticipated. So he's going to give us some very practical tips for church leaders and church communicators thinking about crisis communications. Let's jump into the conversation with Justin Dean. Justin Dean, I'm so glad to have you in this tutorial session today because you have a ton of experience and background in dealing with crisis communication for church. So can you introduce yourself to us first, and then we'll dive into some of your best tips, some things for people to think about if they're in the midst of a crisis.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for having me on this. I hope it's helpful. A little bit of background on me. I'm a Christian entrepreneur. I started That Church Conference and SundayU.com, which both just provide training and resources for churches. Probably relevant to this conversation is years ago, I was the communications director for Mars Hill Church and Mark Driscoll, and arguably kind of led communications through one of the biggest kind of PR issues in the church, kind of in the modern era. That wasn't a sexual scandal or something of that nature, and so learned a ton from that. Wrote a book called PR Matters that kind of shares some tips from that, and have come a long way. It's about 6 years ago now that church closed at the end of 2014. So. I've kind of spent some time helping churches since then get through different crises of different natures.
Yeah, so like no pressure, there was no pressure on you or anything. There was no public eyes on, no public relations problems that you maybe had to. I would imagine that in your book you go more into, what that would have felt like as you're making decisions that you hope are right in the moment. And for people who are in that or want to get prepared for being in a moment like that, you kind of hope it never comes. But
Right.
if it comes, we'd love to get some practical ideas from you of what you've learned about some things that people should be thinking about if there's a big kind of public problem that they need to address in their church community.
I've spent the last 6 years helping other churches navigate, how to prepare for a crisis. Trying to teach them a little bit of to get over the naivety of this can't happen to us. Because honestly, at Mars Hill, we were a huge mega church, 15 campuses, a Bible college, a music label, just massive organization, and one of the fastest growing churches in America. And then suddenly, within months, it was no more, and we literally thought, this could never happen to us. And even today, it's hard to point to, okay, what was it that happened that caused such a PR disaster, really? And so I try to let churches know, hey, this can happen to you, especially in today's world, with so much going against churches. I'm here in America. It's easy for us to sometimes cry we're being persecuted and realize, hey, and everywhere else in the world, they're dealing with real persecution. But certainly it's hard to be a Christian and a Bible-believing church in America or Canada or really anywhere in the world right now. And So we need to be prepared for those types of things. A lot of the issues that I've helped churches navigate over the last few years are simply just accusations. Anybody can make an accusation against your pastor. There's real evil in the world. There's people who have been hurt or even abused who then will, become public and say things about your church, and you need to be prepared for that. The way that we're more active on social media these days opens you up to reach a lot more people in some really great ways and spread the gospel in some really great ways, but it also opens you up to be more susceptible to accusations or PR issues. Simply somebody replying to a comment these days can really blow up into something major that can be an issue for your church. And so you want to be
Cancel
prepared.
culture, right?
Oh
Like
yeah.
people are more than it was even at Mars Hill. There's this cancel culture in the water of something happens and the person or the organization is just done,
Oh
canceled.
yeah. Oh yeah. Big time. And it can happen so fast. And even if you are prepared, it's really hard to navigate through that. And I thank God I didn't have to uh, go through the things we went through at Mars Hill today. Even 6, 7 years later, I just can't imagine going through something like that now. And I've helped churches go through. Some pretty big accusations and things, happening to their churches now, and it's a lot harder. Things move a lot quicker, and you've really got to be on top of it. So, I mean, really, it comes down to some pretty core, easy core principles when preparing for this kind of stuff. The first thing I really try to get churches to understand is we're all in PR. Like, you don't have to have a PR person at your church, whether you're a small church or big church. That may be a role that you're just like, we'll never hire for that. And I totally understand that. But we need to realize that everything we do and say is PR. PR is just the perception of your church. And when someone is in a PR role or managing PR, or you have a communications person, their role is to align that perception with the reality of what you actually believe and what you're actually doing and what you're actually saying, trying to mesh those through marketing, advertising, communications, social media, and whatnot. Because when accusations are made or something does really happen, or even natural disasters or social media comments, go wrong, you want to be able to control that narrative and that conversation to steer it back to, hey, here's the reality of what's really going on. Here's what we really believe. Here's what really happened. And here's our mission of being able to spread the gospel and steering things back towards that, and not in a manipulative way. People hear me say control the conversation or control the narrative, and they're like, that's just spin. You want to spin it how you want. And certainly, with just like with anything, there's room for abuse. Like, you can certainly spin things. You can certainly lie. You can certainly sugarcoat things, or throw some marketing speak on things, or just not exactly tell the truth in order to paint yourself in the most positive light. And I'm here to say, like, don't do that at all. Like, that's not at all what I'm talking about. I'm talking about being transparent as much as you can, or at least being candid, saying, okay, here's what's really going on. Here's what we can tell you and what we can't tell you. Here's what we know right now, and here's what we're trying to figure out. And being able to just explain yourself well and communicate well through an issue, and just being honest and speaking out of integrity and love for people. I think, we often just get scared. We act out of fear when situations like this pop up, and we forget that, if we're really doing something that the Lord wants us to be doing, He's going to carry us through that, and we need to have integrity and honesty and act out of love through that, and it's going to be okay. You might take a hit here or there, but it will be okay. And so, once you kind of have that in mind, and that's where you're working from, you can begin to create a sort of crisis plan. And I mean, like, an actual documented plan. And I think that's helpful for churches, whether they're big or small. And really, that starts out with, um, I think the number one thing churches need to figure out right away when they're talking about putting down a crisis plan on paper is to figure out who is your spokesperson. And that spokesperson might be someone different per event. And so it's even good to start thinking through what are the different types of crisis that we can go through, big to small. Certain areas of the world, there might be certain natural disasters and things that you're susceptible to. Maybe your pastor is a little more outspoken on issues about abortion or homosexuality or things, that are a little more controversial. It's like, okay, these things might get us in trouble with certain groups or in certain ways, so that's something to plan for. As you start a building campaign, just kind of thinking ahead and thinking, okay, we're starting to grow, we're starting to spend more money. People might have issues with that. What are we going to say if that comes up? Think through pretty much every scenario you can think of and actually start building a plan for each one of those as if it actually happened. And say, okay, if this comes up, who's going to be our spokesperson for that? Is it going to be the lead pastor, or is it going to be the communications guy, or is it going to be the worship pastor? It's really just
Because of
choosing.
course, if the crisis is with the lead,
Yeah,
he or she, they can't
right,
be the spokesperson if they're the one who caused the crisis.
right, exactly.
You need
I
somebody
think
else. Yeah.
95% of the time, it's probably not going to be your lead person. Not only because when the lead person talks, it elevates the situation just automatically because it's the top person. When you go to file a complaint with Delta or Coca-Cola or Nike or Target or Walmart, you don't automatically get a response from the CEO. It just depends on what the issue is. And so in a way, you kind of want to protect those people in those roles because their role is just really tied in with the perception of the church as well. And so as much as possible, you want to avoid that. So, identifying who is that communications person. If you don't have a communications person on staff, it's like, okay, who's kind of filling that role? They need to be able to communicate well, either through writing or, on camera or over the phone. But that's the person who's going to reply to press inquiries if they come up. It's the person who's going to help craft the messaging if people are on social media or emailing in about an issue. And you need to just kind of have that planned out. And the reason why you want to have it planned out ahead of time is because when something happens, it moves pretty quick, particularly if like the press is getting involved and stuff like that. And so you want to have that ready to go. Say, oh no, everyone direct everything to Jim. He's the one who's going to handle communications on this. That way, you're not going, oh, New York Times is calling, and there's this huge accusation against the lead pastor. We'll get back to you in 3 days while we form a committee to decide who's going to actually talk to you. And it's not going to happen. They're going to run the story, without you. And so having that plan in place ahead of time really, really helps. And I think, most of these things you can anticipate ahead of time and actually start writing out. What would our, stance be on this? What would our reply be? And write that out now. In the moment, you can do some final tweaks and make it a little relevant to the situation. But if you have 80% of that statement written already, you're going to be able to move a lot quicker and shut down those bad conversations quicker. And it might take you a week, might take you a couple days to kind of prepare all that ahead of time, but do it now before, something happens. I suggest if you actually have a team of people, do this at one of your retreats or one of your, next kind of business meetings and say, can we just take a few hours, really throw out some ideas and just start building these communications ahead of time. And all of that's kind of proactive stuff that you can do that's practical. And I think the other aspect I want to share is through thinking through proactively how we manage our perception of the church. A lot of that relies on relationships. Like relationships are really the key that make PR different than advertising or marketing or anything like that. And I think you need to have someone in your church, whether it's the lead pastor or communications person or whoever kind of takes on this role, but part of their duties needs to be reaching out and building relationships with people not only inside the church but outside the church. So I mean, with other organizations, with other churches, especially with like local news media and national news media, but particularly local. You can find out like who are the bloggers in your area that are active, who are the national newspaper people who are writing on faith and things like that, and really start reaching out to them, get to know them. Like I used to just tag these people on Twitter and say, hey man, I love that article you put out. I'm the communications director at Mars Hill. If you ever need anything, let me know. Like praise them. It's just like you're making friends with anybody. Praise them, give them stuff. Don't ask for anything. Just build that relationship, because when they are coming to write a story about you, they're gonna reach out to you. For one, they're gonna know you already. They're gonna have that relationship with you already. But it's also gonna kind of lessen the blow a little bit, because there is a bit of a relationship there. And when you want to promote something nice, like, hey, we just opened a soup kitchen or a food bank, or we've got a new building, and you want to pitch them a softball story, they're not really going to pick those up unless you've already got that relationship with them. Then you've got a better possibility to do that. But it's all just kind of building that equity up for if something does
And
happen.
helping them do their job in a good
Oh, for
way
sure.
is also what I'm hearing you say. It's not necessarily that journalists are lazy. I guess some
Yeah,
might be, but it's that they're busy. They're busy like everybody else. So if you've
yeah.
provided them with the contact and the some of the content in advance, you've helped them look good at their job.
I mean, you'd be amazed at how many news stories out there were written by the subject of the story, or the PR person behind it. I mean, you probably wouldn't, but most people would be amazed behind this. Like, it's and that's really the key. Like, if you want to actually get your quote in a story, or you actually want to push out your own story, you've got to do all that work for them, because these guys these days, like, they're having 2 to 3 stories a day as their mandate to push these out. Like, gone are the days where they spend a week spotlighting a story, or even interviewing people. Like, if they call and you don't pick up, it's done. Like, they're already moving on. They don't care. They'd rather update the story later with your quote, or something like that, after everyone's already read it, than actually take the time to get it right the first time. And it's not that they don't want to; it's just that they can't. They just don't have the time. And so if you can actually feed them, say, hey, here's the story. I've written it. Here's some quotes. Include quotes from your lead pastor. We used to just write quotes all the time and make it up, and you run it by the lead pastor. Hey, is it okay if we attribute this to you? And you make sure all that's on the up and up. But you if you provide that to them, for one, if it's enough content, they're just going to run with it. They're not going to push back and verify anything most of the time. So you do want to make sure everything's factual and accurate, but provide high quality photos. Otherwise, they're going to choose whatever pops up on Google Images when you Google your church. So if you want a better looking photo, you want to provide that. Um, and this applies when submitting your own story to them to run, or if you're replying to something that they're inquiring about. You want to provide as much detail as you can.
Uh, I'm a piece that maybe is important to talk about, because I've had smaller versions of this. You've had a really public version of this. Do you have any guidance for people on their own kind of mental health boundaries? I mean, you're not a therapist, but I just mean that you're often, if you're the person who's the face and the communicator for a crisis, you probably didn't cause the crisis, but you're dealing with a lot of you're getting punched every day that this thing's going on. So
Yeah.
you've gone through this. Can you just a word of advice for people around how to care for themselves in the midst of the craziness?
Oh, totally. No, that's a really, really great idea. Question. Good. Thank you for asking that. Because I mean, we when we left Mars Hill, and everything closed, like, we lost a lot of friendships and a lot of relationships, because for that last year, I mean, I was the spokesperson for the church. We're on the front page of the New York Times twice, and the Seattle Times, and we're all over the nightly, television news, and it's all my face and all my quotes, and people just garner their own perception from what's being said, and it causes a lot of problems. And so there was a lot of heat on us, as a family, and that was tough. It certainly was just long night after long night, kind of at the end there, and that's obviously we went through a pretty major crisis. Situation that lasted a few months. For others, it might just be a few days or something that you go through. But it is tough, particularly when it really isn't your fight. You're just kind of the one thrown in to take care of it. And so what was helpful for me, though, is really just staying grounded in your core purpose of why do you work at a church. I had left the corporate world, doing marketing and advertising for some pretty major companies, to go work for the church. And I made that choice to make less money and work more hours, and jump into kind of a middle of a controversial arena there. And that was because I believed in the mission and believed in the things that we were doing. And so for me, I might have spent Monday through Friday writing press releases and statements and responses and doing camera interviews. But when Sunday came, I was in that tub baptizing people, because I needed that connection of, why are we doing this? Why am I taking these reputation hits? Oh, it's because people are still lining up to be baptized at the same church that is in the front page news, getting taken hit after hit. That's because God was still alive and working through what we were doing. And so staying connected with that, leading a small group, having a core group of friends who can really speak in and maybe even let you vent, and speak into just kind of how you're doing mentally is definitely a good thing, and practically what got us through that season.
My last question is, if you could speak to, assuming that they're not involved in the crisis, the senior leader or the board, whoever is above the person who's leading the communications.
Yeah.
Again, whether that's a communications director or just a person on the staff of the church,
Right.
what do they need to give you? How can they help you make your job easier? If they're listening to this, the senior leader, what could they do to support the
Yeah.
comms person?
Yeah, that's great. So I think, when it comes time to managing a crisis, you need that authority and approval pretty quickly. And so as much as they can offer kind of pre-approval on stuff, would be great. Like, one of the best things you can do is literally write up an FAQ of like all your statements and beliefs that that your church adheres to, and have those approved and ready to go. Okay, what is our stance on homosexuality? What is our stance on women in leadership? What is our stance on gay marriage? Like, everything crazy, controversial, that aren't things that you probably even talk about ever, but when they come up, you want to be able to have, no, here's our approved statement on that. I have the authority to just reply to you with this, and put this to rest, and be done. What you don't want is when those things come up to be like, we've got to spend 6 days writing a statement, getting it approved, running up to the committee, getting the board to approve it. If that's the process at your church, and that's pretty common, do that homework and work now. Get that all approved now. Have that stuff written out and put on a shelf, and ready to use when you need it. And then have the plan in place of who's going to run this stuff, and leadership should give that person some authority to actually lead and get it done, and particularly when it comes to social media. So the worst thing that can happen is someone commenting something controversial on a Facebook post, and the social media manager having no authority whatsoever to actually reply or engage with that at all. And things move so quickly in
On
real
your
time.
Instagram, for example, but that
Yeah.
the person running Instagram has no authority to do anything or speak.
Yeah. And then it's sitting there unanswered. Other people quickly are chiming in before you actually get approval to reply with something. There's 50 comments, and it's moved on to another issue. And when you do reply, it just sounds tone deaf or irrelevant. And so they need that authority. You need to be able to trust people in those positions. Don't pawn off the social media manager role to the admin assistant or somebody who's not going to be able to handle situations like that. Have someone in that position, whether they're a volunteer or not, that will be able to handle it. And just have those conversations ahead of time. What are we going to do? What are we going to say if something like that comes up? And that way they have that confidence to be able to know, I got this, I can reply and take care of this quickly before it escalates more.
I love this, Justin. What you're talking about is prepare before the crisis. So nobody expects, wants a crisis, but you're saying we can plan for it and then ride it a little bit differently, ride the waters of that differently in the midst of it. Justin, if people want more of this from you, where do you want to send them today to get more Justin Dean?
You can find me on everything. Just go to that justindean.com. You can find links to everything. My book is called PR Matters: A Survival Guide for Church Communicators. You can find it on Amazon. It does include a crisis plan template, so it's a complete, fully comprehensive crisis plan that you can kind of plug in some data and use it for your church. And it gives us a good foundation for getting this stuff started. I know, hundreds of churches have written in, just finding that incredibly helpful because they don't have, a communications team or the resources that we had at Mars Hill. And so happy to provide that. And I will say, I don't charge for my services helping churches and things like that. Like, this isn't my job to do crisis management or anything like that. I love being able to just help churches when they call. And even the book, it's not something that makes a ton of money, mainly because I keep giving it away for free. So I will say, anybody who's listening to this or watching this and they're kind of in a pickle, just hit me up. I'm happy to give you the book. I'm happy to give you the crisis plan. I wrote it to help. And so I hope it's helpful for you.
Thanks so much for checking out this tutorial. It's brought to you by the Canadian Centre for Christian Charities, who knows that it takes a lot to run a church in regular life, let alone in a crisis. So in a crisis or in your day-to-day, if you're thinking about HR, you're thinking about finances, you're thinking about legal issues, thinking about taxation, thinking about pension plans, health insurance, all these kinds of things that are part of running your charity that you may not be an expert in. Well, that's why the Canadian Centre for Christian Charities exists, to serve you, act like an extension of your team. And starting at just $270, the membership is really accessible and affordable to organizations of all sizes. So I want you to go to cccc.org and check out the resources, the member portal, the tools and tips and experts that they have to support you in your ministry, in day-to-day life or in a crisis. Thanks for watching.